Well, 12 months ago, I had no idea who Cecil Spring Rice was. I was idly Googling to find out who had written the words of one of my favourite hymns, and that is I Vow to Thee, My Country. It's a very famous hymn in the UK, and it's very well known here in Canada. It was sung at Princess Diana's wedding and at her funeral. It was sung at the opening of the Paralympic Games. I knew that the music was Gustav Holst, one of our favourite and most famous British composers, but I had no idea who'd written the words, and it was Cecil Spring Rice. Cecil Spring Rice was a British diplomat, so a former colleague of mine. He was the British ambassador to Washington during the First World War, so nearly 100 years ago. He was sent to Washington with primarily one simple objective, and that was to get the Americans to abandon neutrality, to join the First World War effort, and to send over the troops, which ultimately they did in 1917 following the sinking of the Lusitania. So he'd written the poem originally in about 1912 while he was ambassador in Stockholm, then came to the United States, and on his way out from the United States at the beginning of 1918, just before the end of the First World War, he came through Canada and he died in Ottawa. He was staying at Rideau Hall, died there, and is now buried in Beechwood Cemetery. So on one of my trips to Ottawa last summer, I went to Beechwood Cemetery and found his grave. And I thought, well, we need to do something about this. He, I think, has been pretty much lost to history, both as a diplomat but also as a wonderful author. So through the generosity of the Freemen, we raised some money to have a memorial plaque placed by his grave. We've had tremendous support from the cemetery, from Beechwood Cemetery, who love the story. I found his granddaughter and his great-grandchildren from the United Kingdom who are coming across for the ceremony in early June. And when I sort of did some more digging, I discovered that he was a Balliol man, and there are two prominent Canadian politicians who were at Balliol, both Chris Alexander and Bob Rae, who have been hugely supportive. So we're going to have a small ceremony at the beginning of June by his graveside to unveil the memorial, which his family will be doing, and then to have a lunch with the newly arrived British High Commissioner at Earnscliffe, which of course is Canada's first Prime Minister's home, John MacDonald.
I think it's worth remembering, as speaking as a diplomat, and Ashley and Julia and others here, we have objectives with what we do in our work, and Sir Cecil Spring Rice, as ambassador in Washington, had one very important one, which was to persuade US public opinion and the US administration to join the Allies, Canada, UK, and others, in the First World War, to bring it to an end more quickly. And it was, as we've heard, a huge achievement that he brought off, and that I think is a real tribute. One can only speculate as to what might have happened, what the course of the war might have been had he not succeeded in that endeavour.
On behalf of Cecil Spring Rice's family, may I say how honoured we feel to have been invited here today, and how deeply we appreciate the recognition being given to my grandfather. As Cecil was no stranger to Canada, and I think he would be content to lie here in Ottawa, where his last weeks must have been happy, staying with the Governor-General, who was a cousin of his wife, and enjoying family life with all the children of both families, after the appalling stresses and responsibilities of Washington. Cecil had been warning about German militarism for 10 years at least. Cecil came from a close family. He was one of 8 siblings and also had a large circle of lifelong and devoted friends, to whom he wrote regularly and at length. Many of these were American. Cecil was a born storyteller, and he wrote verses of all sorts throughout his life, from humorous doggerel and trivia to serious sonnets, and a charming children's story written for his 3-year-old daughter, my mother, in hospital, and delightfully illustrated by himself. In 1920, Longman's Green published a volume of more than 100 of his poems. There was one about him, and the version my mother always quoted was, "Next come I, my name's Spring Rice, I have not one redeeming vice. I'm as Irish as the weather, you must take me altogether, hopeless of distinguishing which is rice and which is spring." As a poet and storyteller, he had a mystical streak that fed into his religious belief. However, for his wife, I think he must have been a constant worry. Often ill, he made no sort of allowance for his health and strength, but worked unremittingly, usually at top speed. He had great charm and was often brilliant in conversation, with a quick wit and ready tongue, but he could also, of course, be moody and pessimistic. His wit sometimes led him into trouble when he couldn't resist making an undiplomatic wisecrack. The burden of his office, together with the stress and anxiety of wartime, including the death of his brother, must have weighed heavily on him. When he was removed from office in December 1917, with brutal suddenness in the form of a one-line telegram, which is unusual to address an ambassador like that, we believe it broke his heart.